What if your family was locked inside your home not for protection, but as a death sentence, and the door was nailed shut from the outside? What if your city stank not of fire or waste, but of bodies rotting behind silent walls? Imagine a world where drinking water could kill you faster than starvation, where the wealthiest fled at the first whisper of disease, and where children learned to spot the signs of death before they could spell their own names. This isn't a horror movie. This was real life in 1348, a time when 1 in every 3 people you knew would vanish without a trace, when rats were everywhere but no one blamed them, and when survival meant making choices so cold, so brutal, that even the healthy feared being seen. Before masks, before medicine, before science, there was the plague. And it didn't just test the human body, it tested the human soul. What if survival wasn't about strength, intelligence, or faith, but luck, silence, and the sheer will to walk past your neighbor's locked door without collapsing from grief? What if the greatest horror wasn't the plague itself, but the deafening stillness that came after the silence of a city whose streets were once loud with the clatter of market carts and church bells, but now echoed only the rustling of rats and the groans of the dying? We often romanticize the past, imagining castles and chivalry, but rarely do we imagine the scent of decay creeping through shuttered wooden slats, or the image of a child watching her mother's face turn black with swollen boils while knowing no one, not a single soul, is coming to help. Welcome to the most horrifying reality our ancestors ever faced, surviving the Black Death in a city bursting at the seams, where faith faltered, community disintegrated, and every cough could be a death sentence. But before we leap into the abyss of this medieval nightmare, let's confront a truth: our modern world, with all its chaos and confusion, there's nothing on the raw terror of 14th century Europe. No hand sanitizer, no vaccines, no hospitals as we know them, just rats, fear, and choices that sound insane to us today but were often the only reason someone lived. In this story, survival wasn't just improbable, it was unnatural. And yet, some did survive. The question is, would you have? Let's find out. Imagine yourself in a medieval city, London, Florence, or maybe Paris. It doesn't matter which. What matters is the suffocating closeness of it all. These cities weren't made for 10,000 people. They weren't made for hygiene, airflow, or even privacy. They were made for defense and trade, which meant tightly packed alleyways, homes leaning over streets, and waste tossed from windows. In every corner, humanity was pressed against itself, sweating, praying, gossiping, and, in that closeness, something was waiting. We like to think of disease as invisible, but in 1347, you could smell it, you could hear it, you could feel it in the way the dogs stopped barking and the priests started avoiding eye contact. Before a single doctor ever named it, people knew something was wrong. But what could they do? Most didn't know how to read. There was no news cycle, no public health alert, no phone call from a concerned neighbor, just silence broken by the occasional scream and rumors whispered like prayers. There's a sickness. It came by ship, ... It turns your body black. If a city was lucky enough to have a port, it meant trade, prosperity, and doom. Ships brought goods, yes, but also rats. And on those rats, fleas. And in those fleas, something microscopic that changed everything. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the Black Death, was as unknown to them as oxygen or germs. But ignorance didn't stop death. In fact, it sped it up. By the time anyone noticed the rats acting strangely in their hiding places, stumbling around in daylight, dying in open view. It was already too late. The fleas had moved on. They didn't need rats anymore. They had humans. Imagine this. One day you're at the market haggling over salted fish. 2 days later, your neighbor's children are feverish and coughing. By the end of the week, the fishmonger is gone. And the week after that, the market itself is abandoned. You think maybe it's just a bad illness, like the ones you've seen before. But then you hear about an entire family sealed inside their home by city guards, the door literally nailed shut from the outside. Not because they were dead, no, because one of them had a cough. That's when it hits you. The fear isn't in the sickness, it's in the living. You realize the scariest thing isn't the disease itself, it's how quickly your world will erase you if you become a risk. You cough once and people avoid your eyes. You cough twice and your fate might be sealed. Now imagine what you'd do next. Would you stay? Would you run? Would you hide a sick child and pray no one notices? Because make no mistake, these were the choices people had to make. Not over months, but over days. And not in theory, but in brutal, real time. Some people tried prayers, some tried potions, some tried to flee, and some tried to deny the truth until it came to their own doorstep. But the truth doesn't wait. It doesn't knock. It kicks down doors. In the medieval city, everything was stacked against you. The air, the water, the very streets themselves. People didn't know about bacteria, but they knew about smells, and when the air turned sweet and sickly, everyone felt it in their bones. They called it miasma, the corruption of the air. They didn't know that what they were really smelling was decomposition from behind closed doors, families who never even had time to scream. And yet, amid this horror, something fascinating happened. Patterns, accidental patterns, survival behaviors. Some people lived, not because they were smarter or stronger, but because they did things that just happened to help. A wealthy merchant, for instance, might hear rumors of death coming up the trade road. He doesn't wait. He packs his family, his gold, and his clothes, and he leaves. He doesn't understand why the countryside is safer. He just knows that the city is not. That flight would become the single most effective strategy of the plague. But not everyone could flee. Most people, in fact, stayed and suffered and learned, sometimes too late. And yet in their panic, their desperation, they discovered something. Crowd avoidance worked. So did staying home. Not because of bad air, but because fewer people meant fewer fleas and less airborne risk. These weren't medical insights. They were gut instincts. But instincts matter when death is knocking. Now, as we continue deeper into this story, remember this. Survival in the plague city wasn't just about health. It was about timing, access, perception, and luck. It was about making decisions that today might seem cruel or paranoid, but were often the thin line between life and mass burial. And the real terror. That thin line was invisible, shifting, and terribly unfair. Now picture this. The church bells have stopped ringing. Not because the priests are lazy, but because there are no priests left. The few who remain are either sick, dead, or too terrified to come near the dying. You hear whispers that entire parishes have collapsed. A rumor floats by that a bishop fled wearing commoner's clothes. You want to believe it's just gossip, but the silence from the chapel confirms otherwise. Faith doesn't die quickly, but confidence in institutions, that evaporates the moment you realize no one is coming to bury your neighbor's body. And worse, no one cares. This is the stage of the plague that most history books skim over the raw collapse, not just of people, but of systems. There's no law, no order, no market, no clergy. The cobbler's gone. The tailor's shop stands open with half-finished garments dangling in the window like ghosts. The city didn't fall in a blaze, rotted from within. Every function of civic life begins to unravel. Judges stop showing up. Tax collectors are either dead or too afraid to visit. The city council vanished. Guards have either barricaded themselves inside their homes or joined the looters. Even the burial crews, the so-called plague carts, start to demand 10 times their wage, and who can blame them? Every trip to collect a body is a gamble with death. Some refuse to do it altogether. Some disappear overnight, taking their masks and their carts with them. In this crumbling ecosystem, the only constant is fear. And with fear comes desperation. Picture a street where half the doors are nailed shut. Inside, families, some sick, some perfectly well, all doomed. The logic is cold contain the infected, even if it means entombing the innocent. You might think this was an exception, but, in truth, it was common. Cities tried anything to slow the spread. One of the most terrifying tactics was home sealing. If someone showed symptoms, the city's officials would come in the night, hammer would across the doorway, and mark it with a sign. That home was now a tomb, and inside, the people left to scream, rot, and wait. No trial, no second opinion, just judgment by rumor and fear. So, if you were healthy and someone in your house began coughing, would you report it, or would you try to hide them, praying they'd recover before anyone noticed? Because if a neighbor saw, if someone whispered, your home would be next. These weren't hypothetical decisions. These were hourly calculations, and they created an undercurrent of paranoia so deep it fractured communities. Friends became threats. Strangers were death on 2 legs, and outsiders, forget it. Cities began sealing their gates entirely. No trade, no visitors, no exceptions. Ships arriving by sea were ordered to anchor offshore for 40 days, a practice that gave us the word quarantine, from the Italian quaranta, giorni. 40 days wasn't based on science, it was based on fear. But ironically, it worked. Some of the cities that survived best were the ones that closed their doors the earliest, longest, and hardest. Venice, for instance, developed full-scale protocols. Entire islands were turned into holding zones for ships, and sick passengers were isolated before they ever stepped foot on the mainland. In a world that had no idea what germs were, this was remarkable. But even in the best cases, cracks formed, because starvation could kill as quickly as the plague. And for cities that closed themselves off, food shortages became critical. People began hoarding grain. Meat became almost mythical. Chickens disappeared. Cows were too precious to slaughter. Salted fish, when you could find it, was hoarded like gold. But what do you do when the food runs out? You break into your neighbor's house. You steal from the market stalls. You raid the abandoned bakeries. And that's exactly what began to happen. With no police, no courts, and no functioning leadership, survival became a matter of nerve. People banded together in small groups, families, friends, sometimes even rival factions, and formed ad hoc street patrols. These weren't for defense against invaders. They were to keep the desperate from stealing what little was left. But even the best organized neighborhoods couldn't hold forever. Eventually, desperation made everyone a criminal. People began breaking into the homes of the dead, searching for food, clothing, anything useful. Coins were scooped up greedily, even though they might be crawling with fleas. And speaking of fleas, by this point, they were everywhere. They didn't need rats anymore. The human population was big enough and weak enough to sustain the cycle, and still people clung to explanations. They blamed the Jews, they blamed the stars, they blamed travelers, prostitutes, sinners, and even cats. Yes, cats were believed to be in league with witches, so naturally they were killed en masse. This had one horrific consequence. Without cats, the rat population exploded, which meant more fleas, which meant more plague. Another deadly irony: in trying to fix the problem, they made it worse. But some people, against all odds, began to see patterns, not necessarily the true cause, but hints. They noticed that staying home helped, that certain neighborhoods fared better than others, that when bodies were burned quickly, fewer new cases followed, so cities began digging mass graves. Giant pits were carved into the earth, filled with layer after layer of corpses. No names, no prayers, just lime and dirt. In some places, they even began tossing bodies into rivers or abandoned wells, anything to get rid of the rotting flesh. Environmental concerns didn't exist. All that mattered was distance. If a body was out of sight, maybe it wouldn't kill the living. This mindset became pervasive. People stopped touching the sick. Parents abandoned their children. Siblings refused to share food. And in many ways, this was the most painful plague symptom of all: emotional death. The virus didn't just collapse bodies, it collapsed compassion. The very thing that made us human began to fade. Not because people were cruel, but because kindness was a liability. It got you killed. So imagine again, would you survive? Not just physically, but emotionally. Could you become cold enough to walk past your neighbor's screams and not look back? Because in 1348, that was what survival sometimes required. So you've made it through the initial panic, watched the city fracture into fear-driven silence, and survived the first wave of chaos. But now comes the hardest part: staying alive day after day in a place that no longer functions like a city, or even like a community, but more like a haunted maze of whispered rumors, boarded doors, and rotting opportunity. This is the moment where survival isn't about escaping the disease, but about navigating a crumbled civilization where trust is rare, water is dangerous, and food is war. First, let's talk water, because you cannot survive without it. But in the medieval city during the plague, water wasn't life, it was a gamble. The very wells people relied on for centuries became death traps, not because of poison, but because of bodies. Corpses dumped out of desperation, out of panic, or simply out of lack of options. Some households, too poor to pay a gravedigger, slid their dead into wells during the night. Others couldn't open their doors without revealing they're infected, so they heaved the dead from upper windows into whatever opening they could find. The result? Contaminated water that looked clean but killed quietly. Those who boiled their water, often out of superstition or sheer habit, had a better chance. And here's the tragic twist: people who were the most paranoid about corrupted air or the wrath of God sometimes stumbled into the correct behavior for survival, not because they understood bacteria, but because they feared invisible punishment and tried everything to avoid it. Boiling water, burning belongings, avoiding crowds, it was all rooted in fear, yes. But fear can be protective when ignorance is all you have. Now let's talk about food. Forget your medieval feast fantasies. There was no roast pheasant, no fresh bread, no honeyed ale. The supply chains had disintegrated like parchment in fire. The baker was dead. The brewer fled. The markets shut down. What remained were hoarded sacks of grain wheat, barley, rye. These became the currency of survival, the medieval equivalent of canned beans and bottled water. If you had a storeroom filled with dry goods, you had power. Not social power, not prestige, but real survival leverage. People started trading with what they had left. A wool cloak for a sack of oats. A rusty dagger for a wheel of hard cheese. A warm blanket for a bundle of garlic cloves, believed to ward off illness. Money lost all meaning. Coins didn't buy you safety. They bought you suspicion. Why is this man offering gold for a loaf of bread? Is he infected? Disperchi. Dangerous. And beyond barter came the hunger raids. Groups, sometimes families, sometimes strangers started coordinating quiet raids on abandoned homes. They waited until night, cloaked their faces in scarves, and snuck through dark alleys like ghosts with knives. They weren't looting for wealth. They were looking for salted pork, onions, dried beans, vinegar, anything that could be eaten or traded. The moral lines blurred so quickly you wouldn't recognize them. And if someone died and left behind a pantry, that was a miracle. A dead man's pantry became a banquet. But even then, you had to be careful. Food could be contaminated. The rats were everywhere. The fleas didn't care if you were rich or poor, old or young, saint or sinner. And now we come to one of the most haunting elements of survival during the Black Death, the children. Yes, the adults made decisions, but the children, they had to learn fast, faster than any child should. Medieval children were trained not to read or write, but to identify plague symptoms. They were taught how to examine a person for signs of infection. The swollen lymph nodes, the blackened fingertips, the blood in the sputum. They became tiny plague sentries, always watching, always alert, because the price of missing a symptom wasn't just one death, it could be the entire family. Imagine being 8 years old and having to check your sister's armpits for boils. Imagine being told, if you see the signs, don't touch her, don't cry, don't hug, just tell your father, he'll decide what to do. Childhood became a battlefield, and the stakes were existential. Some children saw every adult they loved vanish. Others were the only ones left standing. And then came the other education, what not to do. Don't share food. Don't drink from public fountains. Don't take coins from the street. Don't go outside during the day if you don't have to. Because day meant fleas. Warmth meant risk. So children, like the rest, adapted. They began moving at night, cloaked in dark wool, avoiding other people, slipping from shadow to shadow. Inadvertently, they became some of the most effective survivors. And so did the plague doctors, the strange bird-masked figures we now meme and mythologize. But in truth, they were tragic. Most were not doctors as we understand them today. They were often low-ranking physicians or even volunteers, sent into plague zones to document death and administer basic care. Their masks, grotesque and surreal, were filled with herbs, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloth, thought to purify the air. The long beaks looked absurd, but they served a hidden purpose. They created distance. The beaks extended their breathing space, keeping the fleas at bay. The leather robes, gloves, and boots also helped. Not by design, but by accident. The full covering prevented flea bites. In short, the very absurdity of their costume saved some of them. Others weren't so lucky, because for every plague doctor who survived, 10 died. They touched the sick. They held the hands of the dying, and often they were the last living face someone saw. Their job wasn't healing, it was witnessing. And perhaps there's something powerful in that, even now. Because in a world collapsing under the weight of its dead, having someone record your last breath, to know that your life was counted, meant something. Even in agony, the human need to be seen endures. And just as the plague raged, something else began to rise: pattern recognition. Some survivors began to understand not the science, but the street truths, that narrow alleyways meant danger, that rooms with windows were safer, that wood absorbed odors, but stone stayed cold. People began rearranging their lives. They moved beds near windows. They threw out old straw mattresses. They hung rosemary in doorways, not for smell, but because someone, somewhere, said it helped. A whisper could save your life. Superstition became science by default, and behind it all, the quiet hum of death continued, because the plague didn't come once. It came in waves. And just when people thought it was over, it returned, more aggressive, more unpredictable. And so every ounce of strategy, every instinct, every desperate precaution became the rule book of survival. Now the city is not just sick, it's transformed. The rules that once defined life laws, customs, religion have disintegrated into something far more primal. Instinct, rumor, and whatever threadbare wisdom kept you one step ahead of death. What remains are whispers of morality, faint glimmers of ethics reduced to whether someone helps you carry a body or bolts the moment you cough. This is the long middle of the plague, where the world hasn't ended, but it might as well have, because everything recognizable has been gutted, repurposed, or buried. And now, with each passing week, you face a new problem. How do you live when life itself has become a hazard? Do you take the last of your stored grain and share it with your neighbor, knowing their cousin was seen limping and pale? Do you let the orphaned child knocking on your door in, or do you shut the bolt and pray they don't carry death on their breath? These aren't hypotheticals. These were real decisions made by real people, flesh and blood survivors, who had to decide not just who they were, but who they were willing to become. One thing that began to change everything, even without people realizing it, was the plague's attack on structure. Think about it. If the cobbler died, you had no shoes. If the baker died, you had no bread. If the priest, the tax collector, the city judge died, those roles didn't get reassigned. They just disappeared. No one stepped in to keep it all going because there was no plan. Death moved too fast. In many cities, entire professional classes were wiped out. This meant that even if someone survived the disease, they emerged into a ghost town economy. Shops hung open, doors swinging like silent warnings. No one to claim them, no one to inherit. Inheritance laws, irrelevant when entire family lines were gone. This is where the societal mutation began. Property didn't vanish, just became accessible. Land, homes, livestock, even tools all up for grabs. Survivors who'd once been peasants suddenly had keys to homes they could never dream of affording. A boy who once worked in a blacksmith's stable now owned the forge. A maid inherited her master's estate. There were no court challenges, no title disputes, just survival. You lived, then it was yours. This wasn't kindness or legal evolution. It was raw mathematics. With half the population dead, There were more things than there were hands. But this redistribution came with its own darkness. People started calculating value, not just of things, but of people. A healthy man in his 20s who knew how to forge iron. Invaluable. A sickly old farmer with no family. A liability. Suddenly, worth wasn't tied to family name or religion or royal favor. It was tied to utility. What can you do? What can you contribute? Can you cook, fix, trade, protect? Congratulations, you matter. If not, don't expect anyone to keep you around. And this shift upended everything. For centuries, medieval life was built on a rigid hierarchy. Nobles ruled, peasants served, townsfolk worked. But now the peasants were inheriting estates. The townsfolk were buying land. The nobility, those who didn't die, were forced to offer wages, not just commands. Because what good was land if there was no one to plough it? What good was a castle with no servants, no guards, no food? This was the birth of a strange kind of empowerment, violent, tragic, accidental. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed the systems that held them in place, and it opened doors that had been sealed for generations. But it wasn't smooth. No revolution ever is. Survivors clashed, property was taken and retaken, claims were made with fists and torches, vigilante justice ruled neighborhoods. In the absence of law, power belonged to the brave, the cunning, or the cruel. And the cities that didn't collapse into total anarchy, they started organizing in new ways. Local guilds took over neighborhood councils, replaced governments. In Venice, merchant families became de facto authorities. In Florence, wealthy survivors paid for militias to protect their streets. In Paris, some districts were led by former street thugs turned protectors. The line between savior and tyrant blurred completely, and still the plague came in waves. Each time people thought it had burned out, it returned. The pattern was cruel. Fear would loosen. People would gather again. Trade resumed. Weddings happened. And then another outbreak. A second culling. As if death had unfinished business. And through all this, a strange new class of humans began to emerge. The immune, not many, but some. People who had been exposed, had fallen ill and survived. These individuals became legends. They were believed to be touched by God, or cursed, by demons, or simply chosen. But what mattered was this: they could help. They became caregivers, undertakers, nurses. They weren't always respected, some were feared, but their immunity gave them leverage. And in the chaos, leverage meant power. And here lies another irony. The plague didn't just bring death, it brought choice. For the first time in memory, people had to decide what kind of life was worth rebuilding. Do you go back to the old ways, or do you build something new? Do you trust the same church that said God was punishing sinners, even when the most pious died first? Do you trust the same nobles who fled their cities while the poor were sealed inside? These weren't abstract thoughts. They became real movements. Peasant revolts began in the years following the plague. Labor uprisings, demands for wages. The seeds of modern class struggle were sown not in books or speeches, but in the smoldering ruins of plague-ridden cities. And people remembered. Survivors carried stories like scars. They told their children about the coughing, the smell, the rats. They passed on advice that didn't make scientific sense, but saved lives anyway. Burn the clothes, boil the water, fear the silence. Generations later, When new outbreaks came and they did some of those instincts saved lives all over again. Trauma became tradition, and tradition became a weapon against the next disaster. So now you're alive, not just alive in the biological sense, but conscious, functional, part of a world staggering back onto its feet after an earthquake of loss that restructured everything from economy to family to the very meaning of hope. Here's the truth nobody likes to say out loud. Survival doesn't mean escape. It means endurance, and in the post-plague landscape, what remained was not peace, but reckoning. Because as much as we want to believe that calamity makes people kinder, history shows that trauma tends to sharpen edges more than it softens them. And medieval Europe was no exception, in fact, in many ways. The aftermath of the Black Death was darker than the plague itself, because it left a generation of survivors who were no longer tethered to the world that came before, and who had to face a society where the anchors of identity, class, faith, and routine had all snapped at once, leaving everyone adrift in a kind of social limbo where anything felt possible and almost nothing felt safe anymore. And that's a terrifying kind of freedom. Think about it. For the first time, laborers were negotiating. Farmers were walking off fields and demanding better wages. Women, especially widows, held land, ran businesses, and redefined household roles because no one was left to tell them they couldn't. Orphaned children banded together and formed makeshift families. A teenage boy might be running a butcher shop once owned by a guild master. The rigid feudal system, the spine of medieval hierarchy, had been shattered, not by philosophy, but by arithmetic. If a lord lost 70% of his peasants, what choice did he have but to offer better terms to the ones who remained? That's not idealism, it's survival. The social contract was rewritten out of desperation, and the ink was dried with blood. But this shift wasn't welcomed by all. The nobility, those who had survived, tucked away in countryside estates, returned to find a world they no longer controlled. Their serfs were gone. Their taxes were unpaid. Their authority, once reinforced by church and crown, was now paper-thin. In towns where survivors had carved out their own governance. And so the resistance began. Laws were passed to fix wages, to prevent labourers from demanding more. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351 tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It didn't work. You can't legislate desperation, and you certainly can't legislate away the memory of starvation, abandonment, and betrayal. Workers remembered who had fled and who had locked the doors, and those memories festered. That tension boiled into revolts, the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 being the most famous example. It wasn't just about taxes or wages. It was about dignity. It was about the right to claim a place in a world they'd helped hold together with their bare hands. And beneath all of this was a quiet psychological revolution. People no longer feared death the same way. How could they? They had watched entire neighborhoods fall. They had buried their children, their parents, their priests. The idea of a benevolent God took a beating during the Black Death. Faith persisted, yes, but it changed. People turned to mystics, flagellants, and fringe beliefs. Others doubled down on orthodoxy. Some gave up entirely. Religion fractured, not just spiritually, but institutionally. The church lost enormous credibility. Why had God spared sinners and taken saints? Why had the priests fled while plague doctors stayed? These were the questions whispered in dark corners around smouldering hearths, and eventually they would lead to schisms, reforms, and a redefinition of what it meant to be holy. But if faith broke, so did fear. People who once bowed in silence now spoke with voices cracked by grief and sharpened by survival. The humble began to demand, the obedient began to question, the passive became political. And that is the strange, terrible gift of catastrophe. It unmakes the world, yes, but in the wreckage, it also unmasks power. Once you see that the systems meant to protect you collapsed the moment they were tested, you no longer worship them. You replace them, or at least you try. And so began a century of rebuilding, not just of cities, but of class, economy, thought. Streets were widened, wells were sealed. Sewer systems, once an afterthought, became priorities. Urban planning was reborn from the ashes of mass graves. Cities like Florence, which lost half its population, rewrote their building codes. People understood maybe not the microbiology, but the logic. Cramped, dirty, overcrowded places killed. Clean, open, orderly places saved lives. Public health was born not in hospitals, but in ruins. And medicine. Slowly, cautiously, it began to evolve. The old ideas, miasma, bloodletting, bad humors, didn't vanish overnight, but skepticism had been seeded. Some plague doctors began recording what they saw, patterns, behaviors, outcomes. This was proto-science, not enlightenment yet, but flickers of curiosity unchained from theology. These flickers would one day become the foundation of germ theory, but at the time they were fragile, controversial, often punished, and yet they endured. Because in the silence that followed the plague, people were hungry not just for bread, but for understanding. They didn't want another wave. They didn't want to guess anymore. They wanted answers. And the drive to understand is the first. Step 2, revolutionizing knowledge. Now step back and consider this. The Black Death didn't just kill, it reshaped. It turned a world defined by hierarchy into one marked by fluidity. It taught that privilege could not buy immunity. That status was no armor against fleas. That survival was not a reward for piety. It was a collision of chance, fear, and resilience. And this left behind a generation who, knowingly or not, began to see themselves differently. They were no longer subjects. They were witnesses, survivors, stakeholders in a world that had proven just how fragile every assumption could be. And so we return to the question we began with. Would you survive? Maybe, but real survival, long-term, transformative, purposeful survival, wasn't about hiding from the plague. It was about building what came next. And in the darkest corridors of the medieval city, the light didn't come from saints or kings. It came from the flicker of candles held by people who dared to return, who dared to clean the streets, to feed the orphan, to reopen the forge, who looked at the wreckage and said, "We are still here." That was the most radical act of all. Now imagine standing at the edge of a rebuilt street where laughter has finally returned, faint and cautious like a melody remembered after years of silence. And as your eyes trace the outlines of a city that still bears the scars of mass death-patched roofs, crumbled chapels, empty homes reclaimed by ivy ore, not just witnessing recovery. You're standing in the beginning of something fundamentally new. Because what the plague left behind wasn't just a physical void, but a psychological one. A vacuum of meaning where old truths had died and something unspoken now pulsed underneath everything. A question that no one dared ask aloud. What kind of future do we deserve after surviving something like this? And that question didn't just linger, it multiplied. Because when you've watched the world end, it's not enough to return to normal, especially when normal is what led to collapse in the first place. So plague survivors began to dream differently. These weren't utopian dreams, not yet, but they were dreams nonetheless, rooted in practicality, shaped by trauma, and colored by possibility. What if cities were designed with air and light in mind? What if the poor didn't have to live piled on top of one another like firewood? What if healing didn't mean leeches and prayers, but sanitation and study? These were radical thoughts. In the 14th century, but seeds had been planted and, not just in Florence or Venice, but across Europe. Urban reformers began to think, not in terms of castles and walls, but waste canals, fresh water access, public health. The sheer scale of the tragedy had made one thing abundantly clear. Overcrowding kills, poverty kills, ignorance kills. So rebuilding was more than an architectural project. It was philosophical. And in that rebuilding, something curious began to happen. Art flourished. It may seem strange that beauty emerged from death, but that's exactly what occurred. Survivors painted, sculpted, composed, wrote. The trauma etched into their minds poured out into frescoes and carvings. Entire churches were redecorated not with divine idealism, but with skeletal reminders of mortality. The Danse motif, the dance of death, became a popular theme, a visual language reminding everyone that death is the great equalizer. Kings, peasants, merchants, monks all, dancing with skeletons in mural after mural, a silent acknowledgement that the plague had stripped away all illusions of invincibility. And that art, it changed how people saw the world. The idealized divine gave way to the gritty real, and the real meant pain, survival, resilience. This shift in perspective laid the emotional groundwork for something much larger, the Renaissance. Yes, the Black Death is directly linked to the Renaissance, not just as a historical marker, but as a psychological catalyst. With the old systems broken and the population reduced, there was room for innovation, for boldness, for genius. Labor was more valuable. Education became a path to mobility. And most importantly, people began questioning authority. Not just political or religious, but intellectual. What if the doctors were wrong? Became what if we could find out for ourselves? And that question, born in the ashes of plague pits, would launch revolutions in thought, science, and art. But not everyone moved forward equally. While some cities flourished, others never recovered. Entire villages vanished. Some regions became depopulated for generations. Families who had traced their lineage for centuries disappeared completely. And in those silent places, memory became myth. Stories replaced records. Ghosts replaced names. The plague had not just rewritten the future, it had erased pieces of the past. And yet, in cities that survived, new names emerged. Survivors became founders. Children born in the years after the Black Death inherited not just land and possessions, but possibilities. They didn't grow up under the same shadows. Their teachers were the broken, the brave, the ones who had lived through nights of screaming and years of rebuilding. And those children growing up among massed graves and new guilds, in neighborhoods with fresh walls and fewer lords, became something Europe hadn't seen before. A generation raised not in tradition, but in transformation. That generation would lead Europe into a new era, one shaped by realism, curiosity, and an unflinching awareness of mortality. You see, surviving the Black Death didn't just mean not dying. It meant carrying forward a responsibility to the dead, a responsibility to change the things that allowed death to win. So is it. It meant honoring the buried not with statues, but with better cities, better medicine, better systems. That's how survival became legacy. And maybe that's the final lesson we can draw from it all. Because while we will never know the names of most who died between 1347 and 1351, we are still living in the world reshaped by their absence. Their stories, though silent, echo in every hospital, every public health measure, every sewage line and quarantine protocol. The survivors of the Black Death didn't just endure, they created the blueprint for resilience. And if they could do it in a time with no understanding of germs, no vaccines, no antibiotics, no emergency alerts, then what excuse do we have today, in our era of abundance and technology, to not act wisely, to not protect one another, to not learn? The Black Death was a horror show of epic proportions, but it was also a mirror. It showed humanity what we are capable of both at our worst and our most determined. And sometimes that's what survival is. Not triumph, not comfort, but determination. The refusal to vanish. The courage to look at a graveyard and say, "We will build again." So now you've walked through the worst chapters of a forgotten nightmare, followed the footsteps of survivors across crumbling cobblestones and through plague-slick alleyways, witnessed cities gasp for breath and human dignity splinter under the weight of fear, and yet even in all that darkness you've seen something undeniable: endurance, transformation, and the stubborn light of human adaptation, flickering even when the sky turned black with smoke and sorrow. The Black Death wasn't just a catastrophe, it was a crucible. And what came out the other side was not the same world that went in. Cities didn't just rebuild, they reinvented. The poor didn't just suffer, they demanded recognition. The church didn't just preach, it was questioned. The very structure of society cracked open like a rotting beam under pressure. And from its dust rose new systems, new thoughts, new possibilities. But maybe the most profound thing to remember is this: no one planned for any of it. No one was ready. The survivors were not heroes in shining armor. They were tailors, farmers, midwives, children. They were people who adapted without understanding, who fled without shame, who mourned without ceremony, and who learned, painfully, that survival is not about doing what's right in theory, but doing what's necessary in the moment. And that lesson, that matters now more than ever. Because whether it's a virus, a climate event, an economic collapse, or a crisis we haven't yet imagined, the question we all face is the same. Will we remember what it took to survive before? Will we boil the water, widen the roads, share the grain, rebuild smarter, not just bigger? Will we listen to the silence before the storm and act before the bell tolls? History is not just about what happened, it's a rehearsal for what could. The medieval world didn't have science, or smartphones, or running water, and still, against all odds, people found a way forward. So what's our excuse? If they could survive rats, superstition, isolation, and ignorance, we can face whatever comes next with clarity, with compassion, and with the knowledge that survival isn't a return to normal. It's a transformation into something better. That's the true legacy of those who endured the plague. Not just that they lived, but that they rebuilt. Smarter, stronger, and in some strange way, for us. So when the next trial comes and it will remember their story, not as a horror tale, but as a map. A map written in pain, yes, but pointing forward nonetheless.